Are you considering adoption to build your family this year? Does the steep price tag give you pause? We've got some practical information today to help you learn how to afford adoption. Hello, and welcome to Creating a Family, talk about adoption, foster care, and kinship care. My name is Tracy Whitney. I'm the content director for creatingafamily.org, and I'm also the host of both of our weekly podcasts, this long-form interview that drops on Wednesdays, and then we have a short-form interview, practical advice podcast that comes out on Saturdays, and we hope that you'll check that out. It's called Weekend Wisdom. I am very excited to bring you this episode today to talk about how to afford adoption with Ryan Hanlon, PhD. He is the president of the National Council for Adoption, which is an adoption advocacy organization dedicated to research, education, and policy in the service of all members of the adoption community. Before joining NCFA, as we call it in the community, Ryan spent 13 years working for an adoption agency, and he's also a husband and dad to 4 kids. Welcome, Ryan, to creatingafamily.org.
Hey, thank you, Tracy. Great to be here again, and looking forward to today's conversation.
Thanks for being here. We so appreciate your time. I know you're really a busy guy with all the work that you're doing on behalf of adoptive families across the country.
Well, thanks for that. It's great work, and we have great partners, don't we? It's great to link arms with the many professionals that are serving families and children and the wider community.
Yeah, we are very blessed in the positions where we can have those kinds of partnerships and allies in this work. So I agree. Today's show is aimed primarily at listeners who are just starting to consider adoption to build their families, or are maybe just kind of diving into the research of all things adoption. And so we want to start with the basics and build from there. So let's start with the big question that everybody always asks first. How much does adoption cost?
And then they quickly say, and why is it so expensive?
Exactly.
You're exactly right, Tracy. This is an important topic. It's not the most important topic, of course, but this is an important one because adoption often is expensive. And because of that, it's a real challenge and something that families need to think about in advance and throughout their adoption journey. So in terms of the initial question, how much does it cost? Well, we really need to then step back and say, what type of an adoption are we talking about? Because the most common type of adoption in the U.S. is adoption from foster care. I know you know that. And adoptions from foster care are typically either very low cost or no cost. There are exceptions to that, and we could talk about that if we want to, but the reality is that most families who adopt don't pay that much for adoption. And so then we scratch our head, why does everyone say it's so expensive? Well, because private adoption can be quite expensive, and that would be private domestic adoption or inter-country or international adoption. And both of those options of private adoption are expensive. For private infant adoption, there are pretty wide ranges. Anywhere from, if someone told me they paid $30,000 to $70,000, obviously that's a huge range. But I'm seeing more in the $40,000 to $50,000 range at present in terms of what families are paying to complete their adoption. Soup to nuts, including like post-adoption reporting or placements. All of that. For an international adoption, that has gone up pretty significantly in recent years. It used to be in that like 20 to 30,000 range. Now I think 30 would be on the low end, and I see families spending as much as 50,000 to complete an international adoption. So I think anywhere, again, big range, but there are a lot of different factors that go into why it might be on the lower end of that range or the higher end of that range.
What are some of the reasons you alluded to why people ask, why does it cost so much? What are some of the things that those expenses represent in the process?
Yeah, great question. So depending, again, on an individual adoption, there might be, for private domestic adoption, for example, it might be in-state or it might be an interstate adoption where the parents perhaps are traveling to the state where the child's born. They're going through what we call ICPC, the Interstate Compact on the Placement of Children. They might need to spend another week in that state. There might be travel expenses associated with that. Certainly they're paying for a home study. They're going to have legal fees or perhaps hiring an attorney. Hopefully there's an attorney representing the expectant parents and the birth parents. And on top of all of that, there's an adoption agency that should be overseeing the entire process. And that adoption agency, even if it's a nonprofit, has to be sustainable. That they're going to have to be, charging fees for that to maintain their licensure, their accreditation, all the work that they're doing to, exist as an agency. Most agencies doing private domestic adoption are often doing counseling to expectant parents who often never place for adoption. They get information, they choose to parent, and we can celebrate that as a good thing. From the adoption agency's point of view, that's part of why they exist, is to help women and expectant parents think through whether or not that's the right decision for them. Again, most of them are going to choose to parent, but these agencies are paying at no cost to have those counselors available and to provide services in that regard. And then when we add on thinking about international adoption, the single biggest expense is likely related to travel. And some countries you might be traveling more than once or for an extended period of time. Either way, by the time you're buying international tickets and staying in hotels and all the meals and everything else, that's often the single biggest line item on top of U.S. immigration fees and everything else that's going to be wrapped up in a family's adoption process.
Yeah, those professional services rendered to get you to the point where you can even hop on the plane or go to the next state over to take guardianship and be in possession of that child is staggering.
It is, and what we don't want to do is cut corners. We
Right.
want high quality licensed professionals who are overseeing this process, handling this process. Adoption's not where you want to say, how can I get through this with spending the least amount of money? Of course, that's
Right.
a fine goal to have, but that shouldn't be the driving decision maker. We want the best quality services in support for the family, for birth parents, for adoptees, pre and post adoption.
Yep, that's exactly what I was going to say. Is those professional services are not where you want to be cutting corners.
That's right. That's right.
Most of the hopeful adoptive families that are listening to this do not have access to large lump sums of $30,000 or more. What are the different ways they can pursue affording an adoption, no matter what kind it is?
Yeah, there's a lot we can unpack there, and you're exactly right. When we grew our family by adoption, we didn't have a huge sum of money, in our back pocket that we could just, drop on the table
Right.
or write a check. Instead, it was a planned process, and it was, fees that we paid over time. One thing for your listeners to note is they're generally not going to have to pay $30,000 or $40,000, all at once. Right when they submit, their application to work with the adoption agency, those fees are going to be paid out over time. But in terms of things that they should know, depending on the type of adoption, they might qualify for an adoption subsidy. And so I already mentioned adoptions from foster care are often low cost or no cost. Well, in addition to that, if the child's eligible, and we can talk about that or point to other resources to determine this, the child might qualify for an adoption subsidy where the parents are then getting ongoing support every month, not, tens of thousands of dollars a year, but they are getting ongoing support as part of the state's way to support adoption and to want to incentivize moving children from the child welfare system to the permanency of an adoptive home. One of probably the most important things for your listeners to know is that there are a lot of adoption grant makers who offer support or low-cost loans or no interest or low-interest loans. And these are ways that families often are able to, receive a nice little boost. If they're getting, $3,000, we might say, well, that's not that much compared to the, large fees that are expected. Well, I think most of us think $3,000 is a lot of money, and we're grateful for it. It might be, more than that, could be a little bit less than that. But when they qualify and receive these grants, we might think of that as like a tuition scholarship or something. It really does go a long way. And there are certainly families who are able to qualify or receive, more than one grant from different grant makers. And then on top of that, I encourage families as they're thinking through the process and planning it, is to understand whether or not they're going to be eligible for the adoption tax credit. Many families are, and just this year, Congress made the adoption tax credit partially refundable. So going forward, even more families are going to be eligible to receive that adoption tax credit. So understanding that, whether or not they're eligible, can help them in terms of their thinking through this process. That's going to come for most people. There are certain exceptions. For most people, that's going to come well after their adoption. For example, my wife and I grew our family through adoption. We completed our adoption in early 2018. When we filed our taxes in early 2019, we applied for and then received the adoption tax credit.
And I do want to remind listeners that we have an annual adoption tax credit episode that we air every January, and it is a very thorough kind of deep dive into understanding the adoption tax credit, including the recent changes that Congress just made that Ryan alluded to, and how to maximize that adoption tax credit for their own adoption experience.
Oh, that's great. I often encounter people who don't know about or wish they had taken it and didn't know or didn't think they were eligible, and they probably would have been. So it's important to be sharing that information, and with all types of adoption. But I find especially for those that adopt from foster care, they might immediately think, no, that doesn't apply to me because we didn't have a lot of expenses associated with our adoption. And I encourage not to just stop there, but to really look into it further. They very well might qualify for the adoption tax credit.
Yeah, it's a great benefit for those who are doing any of the kinds of adoption that we're talking about today.
That's right.
What other methods should families be considering to afford an adoption? And then can you, as you run them down, kind of give the pros and cons of each, because some of them are not immediately apparent to anyone who's looking to raise money to do this adoption?
Great question. And I think depending on how far one is from starting their adoption, or if they're in the middle of the process, some of these are going to be better than others. If someone is thinking to themselves, we want to grow our family through adoption in a year or two, I would encourage them to start now in terms of financial savings. They could be putting just even a little bit every month aside, or finding ways to decrease spending so that they have a little bit more saved up, and that can be part of getting started here. So looking at just where they're currently at in their budget to say is there room for change. Certainly before an adoption, or before one's doing a lot of parenting or any parenting, that can be a time where you might think, is there a second job I can get, a side gig? Are there things that we can be, looking around that we don't need anymore, perhaps doing a yard sale, or I'm too ignorant to know how people do it, but I my wife sells things through Facebook or buys things through, these are ways that that I know a lot of families are thinking about, how can we be well positioned financially going into an adoption? When one is really close to or in the middle of their adoption process, I would encourage them to talk to their church. If they're a member of a church or a different faith community, many different churches have supports, kind of like these grant makers do, where they are going to be able to provide support. Certainly employers and employer benefit programs. Not all employers have this, but many do. And there are times where I've met actually a number of people who said, my employer didn't have anything, but when we asked about it, they said, well, we have all these other benefits for employees who are growing their family or utilizing different services. We should have something for adoption. And then all of a sudden, through even a small amount of advocacy or even just asking questions, they're able to establish that not just for themselves, but for other employees or future employees.
Just quickly about the employer benefit programs, what do you see as the most common iteration of that? Is it a grant? Is it a loan, a low-cost loan? What do you see right now?
I haven't seen low-cost loans from employers. Some larger employers or ones that are really wanting to be very supportive of adoption do offer grants. I mean, so very large employers, there are some that say we'll pay for any adoption expenses. That's a rare thing, but that there are employers who do that. Probably what's more common if they are doing a financial payment would be, a grant of some sort. So a couple $1,000s perhaps, or paying for certain expenses associated with it. But the most common in terms of benefits are going to be things like parental leave, paid parental leave, benefits that are common for other employees who are growing their family, and looking at adoption and saying this is an equally supported way of growing a family, and so we want to treat you the way we're treating others, or perhaps even do more because they recognize there might be certain differences like international travel or post-adoption commitments or times that one's going to court. And the employers recognize that and say, we want to ensure you have time to bond and attach with your child. We want to ensure you have the resources that you need to be successful. And what's great, if I can take just a quick moment, Tracy, what's great is that there are researchers who have studied this and found that employees are then more apt to show loyalty and support to their employer if they think their employer is supportive of adoption. And so this can really be a win-win for employees and employers.
Yep.
On top of employee benefits and the increased savings and, getting that second gig, I encourage that to not happen after one's, parenting, because
very good point.
We want to focus on our kids. There are other things I've seen families do. So they do like crowdsourcing. They might do fundraisers. They might organize fundraisers. There are families that get airline miles donated to them, or hotel points, or things that might not be as traditional, or we might not immediately think about it, but can make a huge difference for these families.
And let's talk a little bit about the crowdsourcing and fundraising, because it can be a little controversial in our adoption circles. So let's talk a little bit about what some of the controversies might be. And then also let's talk about how prospective parents can guard and protect their child's story while still getting the word out that they could use some financial help with this process.
Yeah, that's a really important point for us to be mindful of. One of the ways I like to talk about this is that we're not keeping secrets, but we are keeping things private, and there is information that is private, and so we want to be mindful of how we might use a child's picture, how we might be talking about part of their story. Especially, there are differences. One, if you're not even already the legal parent of a child, you need permission to be sharing information and pictures and stories, and you want to be mindful of who might else have access to see what you're saying now or in the future, because you don't want to jeopardize your adoption. But on top of that, we want to be really respectful of our children and of their birth families. And we want this to really be their story to share. If there is some difficult information, they should hear that from us and not from members of the wider community. So we want to be really thoughtful about that. We could focus on, what the prospective adoptive parents are doing. We're growing our family through adoption without having to say, and here's our child's traumatic backstory. That's often not necessary. There might be well-meaning people who are interested, like, why is it that the birth parents chose not to, parent this child? What happened in this child's past? Help me understand more about this particular special need. And we want to be really careful. I like the words you used about being guarded and protective, because that's our role as parents, is to do that. And that should be our role when we're thinking about birth family as well. We want to be respectful, we want to be mindful, and we want, hopefully, to be growing a positive relationship. And one of the best ways to do that is to be protective, but also help understand that what we are saying, even in something like a fundraiser, might be shaping the views of our friends, our family, our community towards our child, towards our child's birth family. And so we want to be positive, and we want to, again, keep private information private.
If a family does choose to fundraise, what are some of the very practical ways that they can protect that child's story and proceed ethically? You mentioned kind of those nosy questions. One of the things that we do in our family to handle nosy questions is answer a question with a question. Well, why do you ask? So can you give us maybe some practical tools like that would help these families that maybe do feel like they need to crowdsource, but they do want to proceed ethically?
Yeah, so when intrusive questions or inappropriate comments come one's way, it is helpful to have prepared in advance. And there are a lot of really good resources, free online resources that prospective adoptive parents and the wider community can utilize and think through what are some of the more common questions that come up and how am I going to answer them? Because what you just said, Tracy, is a great strategy, but in the moment, we're not going to know that, or we're not going to react that way unless we've planned it in advance.
Exactly.
And because typically what happens is we kind of freeze up or we panic and we think, I can't believe she said that, or I can't believe he asked that, or I can't believe this is really happening. And we then might not respond the way we would want to had we spent some time thinking about it. So let's do that. Let's think about it in advance. If someone asks me inappropriate questions about birth family, here's how I'm going to respond. If someone asks me a question that I think is too intrusive, let me understand. And I like your strategy of asking a question. At times, we might, simply say, especially if it's a loved one who is well intentioned, but is crossing perhaps a boundary, is to say, hey, this isn't my information to share. Not keeping a secret, but I'm keeping something private. And it's not about you. It's about wanting my child or whoever we're in that instance protecting. I want this to be their story to tell or their information to share at a time when they're ready for that. And so, knowing in advance how we want to do that might need to be true also for anyone that is in our inner circle or might have more information. We want to equip them as well. So grandparents come to mind, siblings, close friends, other children in the home, especially older children who might get asked questions by their friends at school or teachers or others. How are we going to prepare them to answer questions? And what are we going to say to them to not, again, have a feeling of secrecy, but an understanding of privacy?
Yeah, this is an excellent time for you to be educating yourself and preparing yourself and or any children that are in the home. It's probably not the time to start figuring out how to educate the masses.
Right.
Because you've got to start training yourself that the child's privacy deserves the highest priority first.
I think that's exactly right. And we don't want our child to then be put on a pedestal to say, here's how we're going to teach the rest of the world about adoption or about foster care or about, how to parent. That's not the child's role or place. And that's not the best way to go about that. People might have genuine questions, and maybe we can point them to Creating a Family or National Council for Adoption or many of our partners who have really good information and resources. And that can be how we choose to help them learn more or grow through, wanting to get some answers to questions they have.
Yeah. Thanks for listening to How to Afford Adoption. I hope you're enjoying the show so far with Ryan Hanlon. It's always very informative to sit down and talk with organizations like National Council for Adoption about the work they're doing, and we're excited that this show can help you and your family afford your adoption. If you could take a moment of time and go to the little response link in your podcast player or the link on the YouTube show notes, we want to hear from you. We want to know, is this show hitting the mark for you? What app are you listening to us on? Where are you from? What's your adoption or foster care or kinship care story? And how are you and your family doing in the process so far? What keeps you coming back to creatingafamily.org? We want to know what topics you're interested in. We'd like to hear about any or all of these questions to help us serve you better and help us know if we're serving you the way you need to be served. And so if you could take a moment to respond on your podcast player or the link in the YouTube show notes, we would love to hear from you. And in the meantime, let's go back and finish up with Ryan. So also related to fundraising, what are some of the fundraisers or creative raising of funds, sometimes it's not a fundraiser, that you've seen some families do that are maybe super creative or super effective? What are you seeing out there?
In terms of effectiveness, it's so different from one family to another that I encourage them to lean into their strengths, because what's going to be
Okay.
good for one family is going to be terrible for others. So that's true. I know for our family, and it's what I've seen for others. One of the fundraisers that I really love is called there's an organization called Both Hands, and what
Oh,
they do is they organize service projects, and they call it Both Hands because one hand is designed to be caring for widows and the other for orphans is how they think about this, and they're using their hands, and they're literally going about, and they're fundraising for their community to do a service project to care for a widow or somebody in their community who needs that care, and all of that funding then goes to support their adoption. And so I think donors really love to get behind that because they're seeing something really service oriented and practical, and because they really like to support the family's adoption of that person in their community. So in some ways, it's like double the bang for your buck.
yeah.
Others do things like golf fundraisers. That's not my thing because I am terrible at golf, and that wouldn't be an effective strategy. But for others, if that's where their friend group's at or their community, that can be a really effective way to do fundraising. Yard sales are something I always encourage because most of us need to clean out all the junk we have in our basement or in our garage or wherever. And it can be a nice way to also help prepare our home for a child that's joining our family. And so I think that can be a nice small way to bring in some extra funding. But don't overlook the grant making organizations,
Right.
and don't count yourself out. Really, take those seriously. Do the research. And I think that's the most common. Certainly, when I worked at an adoption agency, that's what I saw most commonly for families that were in process.
Yeah, I've seen the same. I've also seen spaghetti dinners and benefit concerts and kids banding together to offer a service and, please donate to, this adoption process. It's as varied and creative as the families are also varied and creative.
That's right. And don't limit yourself to
Yeah,
what you've heard on this podcast or what you've
right.
seen other families do. There might be new ideas. I heard of a family who made crazy amounts of money through a lemonade stand. Their kids wanted to be involved and help support, and the community loved that, and so they were bringing in a ton of money just through selling lemonade at a stand.
That's so cute. I love that.
Yeah, it's great.
Ah. How far in advance should these hopeful parents start thinking about some of these specific tangible efforts towards affording their adoption?
I've never heard someone say they started too early. So I would say, as early
Perfect.
as possible is better, especially on that piece around the savings and preparing, but even just informing themselves of what the process could look like. We won't know exactly how long it's going to take. No one's going to be able to tell you that. But there's so much that can be done in advance. And so the earlier one starts, the better.
Mm.
And again, never heard of a couple saying we started planning this too soon, or we saved too much money. It's just not happened yet.
So you mentioned that adoption from foster care is the most common form of adoption in the country, and that adoption subsidies and the adoption tax credit are both very common uses
That's
for
right.
or common methods of affording adoption in that particular circle. Can we circle back a little bit to talk about what an adoption subsidy is and why foster parents who are adopting from foster care might already be familiar with that monthly payment?
hmm Foster parents often receive like a different states or jurisdictions can call it something different, but it might be a maintenance fee or so child
Right.
oriented support, and they're getting that monthly. An adoption subsidy is typically not as much as they would receive while they're foster parents, but it can still be a substantial thing. It's important that families know you have to be found to qualify or eligible for an adoption subsidy, and that only happens pre-adoption. And so
Right.
if you're fostering a child or if you're in the process to adopt a child, don't let that adoption become finalized before you've checked for eligibility, applied for, and received eligibility. Now, you might not be eligible. Some families aren't. And if you've done your due diligence and the conclusion is not going to be eligible for subsidy, I don't want to keep you from finalizing that adoption. But the majority of families who adopt from foster care end up qualifying and being eligible for a subsidy. And it's just a tragedy when you meet families who say, no one ever told me about this, or
Right.
they encourage me to just finalize the adoption right away and apply for subsidy later. That's a losing strategy.
Right.
Make sure you apply for that subsidy first, and it can make an enormous difference. And if you think, I would adopt this child anyway, that's fine. Isn't it a great thing that you get this? I think of it just like I think of the adoption tax credit as post-adoption support. This is funding that we can use to help meet our children's needs, and they often do have needs. They're often going to be receiving certain therapies or services post-adoption. We want to have the resources to meet those needs.
So, without getting too specific, what are some of the things that might qualify a family for an adoption subsidy?
Well, if the child's in care, then the state needs to determine that the child is likely in need of a subsidy. And the way they look at that, the primary way one looks at that is through if there's a special need of some sort.
Okay.
And I want to be quick to say the way the adoption community often talks about special needs and the way states and the federal government are looking at special needs is different. And so any family that does an international adoption, even if the child has a medical special need, is not going to qualify for an adoption subsidy. But a child who's placed for private domestic adoption under a custodial adoption agency, if that child has a significant medical need, that child might qualify for a subsidy. And then it changes a little bit every year, but it's something like 90% of the adoptions from foster care are qualifying for subsidy. And the special need determination can be less related to a medical condition, and it could be related to the child's age or some other factor or variable that the state determines makes them less likely to be immediately adopted, and how the subsidy is a way to help incentivize families to move towards adoption.
Yeah. So if you're a family that is fostering a child that you hope to or plan to adopt, please reach out to your caseworker and ask them to explain the process to you and make sure that they're helping you understand whether or not this child qualifies and how to implement all of that before the adoption is finalized.
And if they quickly tell you, no, you're not eligible, do your own research or get a second opinion from someone who's really well informed, because this can be a big deal. This could be a lot of money left on the table. Again, if we look at this not just as more money for my family, but post-adoption support for my child, all of us want what's best for our kids, and we want the resources to meet those needs.
Yeah. And Creating a Family has some great resources on our website that I will link in our show notes about adoption subsidies and how to negotiate them and how to work towards implementation of those to be able to afford the adoption.
Great.
One final interruption to remind you that we have a library of 15 free courses thanks to our partnership with the Jockey Being Family Foundation. These courses are designed to strengthen your family, to prepare you and educate you about issues and challenges you might face as an adoptive family or a foster family, and to build your toolbox to help you better come alongside the child that you bring into your home and support them and serve their needs. You can find that library at bit.ly/JBF support. That's bit.ly/JBF support. And now we're going to go back and finish the show with Ryan. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about where families can go, both in their local community and online, et cetera, to start learning about how to afford adoption.
I think the links you're going to put in your show notes are a great place to start. I know we have a whole landing page on our website dedicated to helping people understand different financial resources, grant makers, loan options, et cetera. And so that's a great place to go. Talk to other families in your community. What did they do? Going to our employers even now, talking to our faith community even now. And the single most practical thing one can do is budget and plan, and
Right.
and get an understanding, when are the different expenses going to come up, what's my cash flow plan to meet those needs.
Yeah.
And when these prospective adoptive parents have a good budget and a good plan in place, it's absolutely possible to adopt, and finances don't need to be a barrier for them. When families have the will, they find a way, and that's certainly true with financing pieces related to adoption. The single biggest concern families have is that finances are going to be a barrier, but it's often much more of a concern before they go into the process, and then looking back, they realize there were a lot more supports that we had than we realized. And once they are better understanding subsidies and the tax credit and these grant making organizations, they recognize it's not nearly as daunting as they thought going in. Like you said in the beginning, most people don't have huge sums of money laying around thinking,
Right.
I wish I could give this to a social service agency out there. But they're able to find a way, and they find their community wants to support them, their friends and family want to support them, and are excited to do so, and that there are a lot of creative things they can do to make the legitimate expenses not become a barrier for their dream of growing their family through adoption.
And I will add, if you struggle with budgeting or if you struggle with understanding your finances, look around for some nonprofits or some people in your faith community or people in your school community who have this skill already, and work out something with them that can help you learn what you need to know about how to budget properly, that can give you some accountability, give you some structure if that's missing in your current financial status. I know we did a program through another nonprofit that helped us pay down all of our debt so that we could roll all of that over to savings. And it was fantastically supportive because it was done in the context of a small group. So each of us had joined this small group for a different reason behind wanting to learn how to save money and budget better. But we were all able to support and encourage each other towards individual goals. And we had some kind of buy-in to each other's goal outcomes, which was very supportive and encouraging.
That there's an accountability factor there, an encouragement factor there. And you're also learning from one another. You're seeing what they're doing. And we might even change our mindset for what's normal. Maybe going out to dinner 3 times a week, is the norm in your friend community. And you then get a smaller community or accountability within a community to say, hey, we're gonna stop doing that for a period of time so that we can save for an adoption, this bigger goal that we have, or so we can put ourselves in a situation where we can adopt, or we can meet children's needs, or we could support someone else's adoption. And that might make it an easier thing to do in a group than just by oneself or just that couple.
And just as you're learning to lean into other people's strengths when you do that and look for budgeting help or fundraising help or whatever, you can be allowing other people to lean into your strengths and trade that for financial services. For example, if you're great at batch cooking and you regularly have 6 or 8, frozen meals in the freezer, consider offering those in trade for either financial help and support, or selling those as a fundraiser, because that's something you've already got a strength in and you can offer. And I think it's a great way to take advantage of your strengths and use them for your end goals. But it's also a great way to let people in, because they feel like if they're getting, this nice free lasagna once a week because you know how to do that, it's a great trade-off.
Well, and people really want to help. People want to come alongside you. It can be a hard thing as new adoptive parents, because you've got actually so many people saying, what can I do? What can I do? And your goal is to be bonding and attaching. So you don't want everyone else helping with your child, but having them do things that are practical, beforehand, during your adoption process, or maybe doing meals afterwards. There are lots of things that can look like support. Our job is to be open to that support, to be mindful and thoughtful about it, but allow others to come in and support you because they want to do that.
And recognize that the support beforehand is going to look and needs to look different than the support afterwards.
Absolutely.
And I appreciate the fact that you keep reminding us that once we have the child in our home, our method of being mindful about our family's needs must change. And that's a really good reminder to prioritize the child's needs once they're home.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And, I always like to joke in conversations about this when people say adoption's so expensive, and I just think kids are so expensive. And so as much as we're budgeting and planning for an adoption process, this is a long-term game here. And we're budgeting and planning for our lives to be changed, for this, might be a cute little kid who's joined a family. That's a cute little expensive kid. And because, there are just a lot of things that come with growing our families, and our ability to be mindful and plan for that in the long term is important.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So let's do a little bit of a deep dive on the resource page that first prompted me to reach out to you. National Council for Adoption has a resource page on affording adoption. So give us the whole spiel.
Yeah, so we created this page because we had a lot of different links and things, and we wanted to put it all in one place where people can find it. We're often asked, how do I afford adoption? Why is this so expensive, and what can I do about it? Just like we've had that conversation today. So it's easy to find from our homepage under resources. Our website's adoptioncouncil.org. This particular landing page, it's adoptioncouncil.org/financial-resources. And when someone goes there, they will learn more and just feel normal, because they'll see, the way they're feeling is the way other people feel. This can feel intimidating or a barrier. But we've got then links to free resources to better understand adoption subsidies, to better understand the tax credit, to better understand grants and loans. Who are these grant makers? What is it? What's an adoption loan? Most people have never heard of that. But there are credit unions and others who want to allow adoptive families to have a good plan in place, and they're not looking for this to be a huge moneymaker for them. What they actually tell me is, Ryan, adoptive families are the best at actually paying back these loans. They've got better than any other service line we do. Adoptive families are good at this, in part I think because they get that big tax credit later, but in part because they recognize how important this is. So the page we have is meant to be pointing people to free resources that are doing our best to make this easy to understand and connect with reputable service providers. These grant making organizations do just awesome work, and it's always surprising to me when I meet a family who hasn't applied for a grant, because I think these groups want to support you. They want to get money. They view this the way you and I do, Tracy, where they view this as post-adoption support and family support to ensure that these families can focus on what is most important and not be stressed by the finances. So these are just awesome groups that we love connecting people to.
Right. Well, I will link the page in our show notes so that families can not just gain conversational input from today's interview, but also the links and the little mini articles, because I've surfed around the page myself, little mini articles about how to afford adoption. I am so grateful, Ryan, for your time today. I think that this is going to be very practical information for those who are kind of just getting started, or those who are maybe starting again and haven't adopted in a while. So thank you for your time and for your expertise, but also thank you for everything that you and NCFA do to support all the members of the adoption constellation in all the families across America that are impacted by adoption. We deeply appreciate partnering with you in these things.
Yeah, thank you. It's a pleasure to do that work, and to partner with Creating a Family and others to serve this community is just a real privilege. So appreciate the time today, and just want to reiterate to families that are intimidated by this, it is possible. You will find a way. You'll find lots of support and people who want to support you along the way. So don't let that keep you from your goal and your dream of growing your family.
Oh, excellent last word. Thank you so much.
Thank you.